The state of the British Railways at the minute is a bit of a farce. For those of you who aren't exactly in the know, to give a very brief history lesson, between 1948 and 1997, the British Railways were under the purview of the British government body, British Rail. The Conservative government didn't really like British Rail, or the fact that anything could be under public ownership, and so in 1994 they began their first steps into privatising the British Railways, a scheme that collapsed spectacularly in 2020 during the pandemic. However, they're not going to fully renationalise the system. Instead, they're going to do this weird pseudo half-nationalised, half-privatised system where all the trains are still privately owned and are still privately operated, but they're all going to be under the overwatch of a new government body called Great British Railways. That's at least how I understand it. I might be wrong, so don't quote me on that. One thing I can be sure of, however, is that currently all the trains are owned by leasing companies, such as Porterbrook and Angel. And as far as I know, that system is not going away anytime soon. The entire train leasing thing is not a good idea because it completely takes away any common sense that would go into the transfer and operations of the various trains. The whole franchising system and the leasing system has just been a big disaster for British Railways, and there are two big examples that I can think of that really kind of resonate with me. For this, we are going to be talking about GTR, or Govia Thameslink Railway, and one of the largest companies under its purview, Southern. At the beginning of 2022, Southern had 3 types of electric multiple units in service, including this, the Class 313 3-carriage EMU, the oldest mainline electric multiple unit in service in the entire United Kingdom, with a service age of about, 45 years at the minute? 46 years, that after a quick check of the facts. 46 years these trains have been in service. 1976. These trains are very old. Now don't get me wrong, I love them, but it's getting to a point where they are just not really up to the task anymore. Being that they're 3 carriages long, they get pretty cramped, especially during the rush hours of the peak times. And I would know, I've been travelling on them for the past week. They get pretty cramped at 8:30 in the morning. Now the 313s only operate 2 lines, the West and East Coastway routes. The West Coastway route extends from Brighton all the way to Portsmouth, which is usually the furthest that the 313s go west, and then there's the East Coastway route, which extends to Lewes and Seaford. Southern has 19 of these trains. However, as of recording, one of these has already been removed from service, possibly for good, because, well, if you've seen them in real life, you would know that they are quite decrepit. They have not been well looked after at all. The paint is faded, the decals are falling off, they're just not in a good state at all. Save perhaps the very first one ever built, 313-201, which is going to be preserved. The fact is, no matter how much anyone loves them, they are at the end of their service life, and they are now in a stage where they are being pushed beyond that, and their service life is set to continue because the only train that could have realistically replaced them from Southern's existing fleet was retired first. On the 14th of May 2022, Southern retired its fleet of 39-year-old Class 455/8 electric multiple units. Now, sure, this is somewhat understandable. They were very close to the normal 40-year retirement age that a train or plane or whatever would normally have. 40 years is a good service life for a train. But they could have just gone a little bit further. To do that, we need to talk about another one of GTR's child companies, Great Northern, but also about another company that is unrelated, Greater Anglia. In February of 2022, Greater Anglia prematurely retired its fleet of Class 379 Electrostar EMUs. This happened because Greater Anglia ordered replacement units for the 317s that were very old, at about the same age as the 455s. These were the Class 720s, which have taken up a large amount of duties across the entirety of Greater Anglia's network, and also they decided to replace the 379s with the Stadler 745s. The main reason that they even considered replacing the 379s was simply because the 379s have a fairly high leasing cost from their leasing company. And so Greater Anglia just wanted something cheaper. I'm going to go into the realms of the hypothetical now and talk about how I would do things if I were in command of a still extant British Rail. If British Rail hadn't been destroyed by the Conservative government back in 1997, if it was still around today, how would I do things? Future Still Guns here, just need to add in something that I forgot during the main recordings. British Rail owned all of its trains, which is why I'm acting as if British Rail would own the trains, because it did. The leasing companies didn't come into being until after the privatisation of British Rail. So British Rail owned all the trains, it could put them pretty much wherever it wanted. So for the sake of this thought experiment, we're going to assume that the Class 745s have still been ordered. Like, if it were me, I wouldn't have ordered them, but for the sake of this experiment, we'll say that I did lose my mind and I ordered the 745s to replace the 379s. So, it's 2022. The Class 313s have been in service for 46 years now. They are old, they are decrepit, they need replacing. So, on the 14th of May 2022, they get retired. 313s out of service, good night, sweet prince. The Class 455s, which have until this point been in use on metro services, get transferred down to the Southern Coastway routes. They can still stay in service because, yeah, they're still old, but they're not as old as the 313s. You can stretch their life out a little bit more. To cover their absence on the metro routes in London, 377s in service with Southern and also 387s from Greater Northern would be reallocated to take their places. However, then you have an issue that Great Northern won't have enough trains for their East Coast mainline services up to Peterborough and Cambridge. Fortunately, there's a bunch of very similar trains sitting in a siding somewhere after they were rendered more or less obsolete by the presence of the new 745s on the Stansted Express route. And now the 379s can continue their line of work in, well, the East Coast Main Line, with Great Northern running up to Peterborough and Cambridge. This way there's practically zero wastage of available units. The 313s, which are old, can be retired and cannibalised for spares if necessary. The 455s can continue working on the Southern Coastway routes, a task which they are arguably more suited for than the 313s because they're an entire carriage longer, so they won't be as packed during rush hour. A bunch of 387s can be reallocated from the East Coast Main Line down to the metro services because they are dual voltage, they're capable of using third rail and overhead lines. And the 379s won't be left rotting in a siding somewhere because they are still working on the East Coast Main Line. Win, win, win. Except that's not how it happened. The 455s got retired first. 14th of May 2022, Southern got rid of all of its 455s. They're the ones rotting in a siding somewhere. Meanwhile, the 313s are still going, looking to break the record for being the oldest electric multiple units in service ever. I mean, 46 years at the minute. If they go on for 3 more years, they'll match the record. 1 more year after that, they'll beat it. That's full-sized mainline units, not like tube trains like the 483. That went for like 80 years in service, but it wasn't a full-sized mainline train. Meanwhile, Southern's fleet of 377s are now stretched to capacity, taking up not just the routes that they were originally designed for, but also the routes that the 455s have vacated because there's nothing else. The 387s are still pootling along on the East Coast Main Line with running express services and the like, with seats that are best designed for commuter services, so they're hard and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the 379s are rotting in a siding somewhere, growing rusty, dusty, and being covered in some uneducated chav's street name painted in garish paint because he thinks that's art. With the train leasing companies, common sense just goes out the window because, in the end, all it is costs. The 379s have a fairly high leasing cost, which means that Great Northern wasn't really interested in taking them on. They'd rather just keep using their 387s whilst everything else gets thrown away, and the oldest units on the network keep going until they literally crash and burn or something. And the 379 debacle is that sort of second example I mentioned. I guess it's just one big example, because we wouldn't be talking about the 379s in the first place if they didn't have that high leasing cost. It's what made Greater Anglia decide that they wanted the 745s instead. So we have the 745s and the 379s. They can't both do the same job, so one had to go. And so Greater Anglia decided to get rid of the completely, perfectly serviceable and very comfortable Class 379s and replace them with the Stadler Class 745s, which are neither. So now for 2 of the units mentioned in this video, there is an uncertain future. The 313s have no clear replacement on the horizon, save for more 377s being stretched for even further beyond their capabilities or whatever. And then there's the 379s, which are stuck in a siding somewhere, and from what I heard, could potentially be sent to South Africa because Gautrain, who operates some very similar trains, might want them. Yeah. So, one train that didn't need replacing got replaced and now has an uncertain future, and one train that needs replacing doesn't have a replacement. As you might be able to tell, this entire scenario is a joke, and I'm upset.